So this is CNET 141. But before I do the lecture, I just want to point out there's the job fair tomorrow. So if you're looking for a job or you want to learn about what jobs are available, tune in tomorrow. It's a Zoom right at the top of my page, samsclass.info, starts at 5. And I'm going to teach a class at 6, but this might be more important than attending my class. You can always just view the video later. So make your own decision about which one to attend to. But if you are looking for a job, I highly recommend going to this to hear what these people say and find out what the requirements are, and then you'll know like what classes to take and so on. So check it out. There's the Zoom link to join. And Steve, the guy that runs this, wants you to sign up here so he can help place you with a job and stuff. Anyway, so don't miss that. And there's a bunch of stuff coming up, by the way. The competition team is forming. Liz will probably be contacting you soon. And VeloCon is tomorrow. If you're interested in Velociraptor, a instant response tool, there's a whole free conference on that online. And then this weekend is Circle City Con in Indianapolis, but I'm teaching 3 workshops remotely, and they're available to anybody. These will turn into links, and you can just join them. It's nothing more than your homework turned into a automatically gamified thing.
How did they get you?
I volunteered. They were going to give us transportation costs and housing. And I said, well, I'm tired of getting COVID. How about we do it remotely? And then I don't have any transportation costs or housing. And they went for that. So anyway, I'll be doing workshop every day there for the weekend. Can one look up your old... What's that?
Is that free to tune in?
Yeah, they're all free. Yeah. And can one look up your old Friday videos? Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel. You'll find them all there. And they're up here, actually. If you go to news videos, here's all those news, all the ones are here. So that's where you find all the old ones, although that's news, so anything more than a few weeks old is probably not that interesting. But if you want them, they're up there forever until YouTube starts taking them down. And they only took down one of my videos, and they put it back. So far, they haven't banned me on YouTube. Good. Anyway, so those are the announcements of things you should know. And now let's talk about block ciphers. And here we get done with the preliminaries. Everybody's doing now is the basics to get you started. Now we're going to talk about stuff that really matters, which is AES. This is what 99% of all the cryptography is, I think. Good, I'm glad you're happy, Mobo. All right, so we'll talk about what block ciphers are and AES, which is the main block cipher that matters. So the US made a federal standard of DES in the 70s, and this one was reasonably strong in the 70s, but by the 80s or 90s, it was no longer strong enough. Computers were strong enough to break it, and then it had been deliberately weakened so the NSA could break in, is what people believe, although I don't think anybody ever officially admitted that, but it was pretty obvious. And so the KGB had one, and so in 2000, they made a better one called AES. And this one is, as far as anybody can tell, truly unbreakable by anybody. If you don't have the key, you're not getting in, which was not true of DES. So a block cipher means you have an encryption algorithm and a key, and you encrypt a block of data, which is typically 16 bytes. So you take the key and the block of plain text, run it through the encryption algorithm, and you get a block of ciphertext. That's it. And to decrypt it, you take the same key and the ciphertext, and run it through decryption to get the plain text. So this means you have a key distribution issue. You must distribute this key to the other person through some trusted channel. And so that's the fundamental problem with all symmetric ciphers. You have to have a shared secret, which is an oxymoron. If you give somebody else a copy of the key, you don't have any way to know that they didn't lose it or give somebody else a copy. So it's fundamentally got a security weakness there. There's 2 security weaknesses. First, you have to somehow deliver the key through a trusted channel. And that means if you had a trusted channel, you don't need cryptography at all. You can just send your message through a trusted channel. And the second one is you don't control the key. There's 2 identical copies of the key, so you don't really know how many copies of that key have been left. But everyone's accepted that since the dawn of time until 1979, when they invented public key cryptography. There was no other option, and we all just got used to that. And you had madness like the old British sailing ships in the days of wooden ships. They had a code book, which was the pattern of flags for military maneuvers, and it had lead in the binding, and the captain was ordered, if your ship gets taken, you throw that over the side. And if your ships get taken and you fail to throw that over the side, we will ransom you to take you back to London and then hang you. Because that book is worth more than you or your whole ship or all your people or anything. And that's the problem with secret key cryptography. You have to keep that secret. But anyway, that's what most people use for most purposes.
So 16 bytes is small enough that it's impervious to any statistical frequency analysis.
Well, the frequency analysis is not really relevant here. In fact, the issue is the block would be too small. It's big enough to be immune from the attack we're going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, 16 bytes is the standard. 8 bytes and 16 bytes are the only ones people have used, and it shows those to fit conveniently into processors. But it turns out anything smaller than 8 bytes would be insecure. There's nothing really wrong with a large block size, but 16 bytes is the current standard. If we actually move up to like 128-bit processors and 256-bit processors, then we might move to a bigger block size, I suppose. This week, just about Chapter 4. Yeah. I'm going to do Chapter 4 and then demonstrate some projects. So you can catch up by doing the projects and lectures on the website. So here's the goals. The block cipher should be a pseudo-random permutation. When you encrypt data, it should look like just random bits. There should be no patterns, so you can't find any kind of weak spot to attack. That's important. It should appear to be just random. So the block size is an issue. DES was 64 bits, which is 8 bytes. AES is 128 bits, which is 16 bytes. And like I say, if you're below 64 bytes, then there's an attack called the codebook attack, which will get you in. Then, even if the key is long enough, the block size is too small. There are not enough possible blocks. So here's how the codebook attack works. If it's a chosen plaintext attack. If you're on a network where you can send data and it will encrypt it, and you can see the ciphertext, then you could just send every possible plaintext block and get the ciphertext that matches it, and now you can decrypt stuff by just looking it up. So that's the trick. It's only possible, though, if the block size is small enough that you can actually create a list of every possible plaintext block in that block size. And so if it was a 32-bit block size, you'd need 2 to the 32 entries, which is 4 billion, and that's achievable. You could have 4 gigabytes of RAM or 4 gigabytes of RAM times some number for the size. That's not impossible. So a 32-bit block size would be subjected to this attack, but a 64-bit block size would be impossible. That's 4 gigabytes squared. So it's 4 billion times 4 gigabytes. That's more memory than you could afford to put anywhere. So that's why I say 64 bits or more is a big enough block size. Below that, it's not big enough. All right, so to construct a block cipher, there's 2 ways to do it. Substitution permutation, which is what the new system uses, and phi-stel, which is what the old system uses. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with either of them. DES was abandoned not because the algorithm was no good, but because the key was too short. We could, in principle, still be using the phi-stel algorithm, but they switched to this one, I think, just to make it faster on modern processors. So you have rounds. You run it through a round of computation and encryption, and then you might have another round where you just run the same function again, and the same function again, or a similar function. That's a multiple round calculation, and that's how almost all these work. And AES has 10 rounds. So when you invert it, you have to do it in reverse order and run the inverse function to back out of all those steps. Now, if you use the same key for every step, that would be weak, as we'll talk about. So what they do is you have a key schedule. You take the main key and you run it through some algorithm to create a series of other keys from it, and therefore you have a different key for each stage of encryption, all determined from the main key. So the slide attack is why you need to change the key. If you had a 3-round encryption here, so you put in your plaintext, you encrypt it, and get ciphertext. Then, if you were able to find plaintext here, which encrypted, if you used this as plaintext, then these would repeat 2 of those steps and get you to a different place. And they don't explain in much detail in the book, but they say the result of this is you'd be able to take this relationship and determine something about the key. And they reference a research paper I didn't read. It's not intuitively obvious to me why that is a weakness, but this is a weakness apparently. This property gives you something you can use to deduce information about the key. And the cure is to have a different key for each stage. So you want all round keys to be different. Now, the best thing would be if the key schedule was one way, like a hash function. So you would, even if you were able to determine, like the key A1 or K2, you couldn't go back and determine the key. That would be good. That is a weakness that was not fixed in AES. AES does have this technical weakness. The key schedule is not one way. If you could determine these round keys, you could determine the main key from them. So that has not turned out to be a problem in practice. There are no attacks yet that do that, but in principle, that probably should have been done some other way. But now we have the standard and we're all using it. Nothing's ever perfect. So if you had a side channel attack, like measuring the electronic emanations of the processor, and you could get a round key, you could then determine the main key from that. So It is, in principle, a weakness, but that's the way it is. So this is using substitution and permutation. Those are the two operations. The two things you want are confusion and diffusion. Confusion means that each ciphertext bit depends on several key bits. So there is not, and that's what substitution does using S boxes, as we'll see. Diffusion means that if you change a bit of the plain text, it changes many bits in the ciphertext. So change one bit of the key, it'll change many bits in the ciphertext. You change one bit in the plain text, it'll change many bits in the ciphertext. There's no relationship like the first byte here only changes the first byte over there. That means that patterns in the plain text and patterns in the key do not appear in the ciphertext, and you have no way to, have no lever to use to break it. That's the idea. All right, so Feistel's scheme was kind of nuts. You break the plain text into halves, left and right, and you only encrypt one half. Then you flip them and encrypt the other half. I don't know why they did it that way, but that's how it worked. So you run this through the Feistel and put it over here, and then flip it over here, and you have many rounds, like 16 rounds. So it can be fine, but a little bit screwy. You only encrypt half the data on each pass. All right, let's try a Kahoot. So if I go here, I've got log in, Google, with OAuth. Yes, all right. Favorites. Okay, 141.4a, there it is. I had to disconnect and reconnect a couple times to get the internet to work in here. It's a little flaky. I'm pretty sure we're on the backup system too. So we're having pretty serious internet problems here, I think. See, we got in, good. See how many people are in Twitch. 11. Okay, so this may be all we're going to get. Let's go ahead. All right, what kind of rounds does AES use? Those things, substitution and permutation, which we're going to see in great detail. All right, so what attack cracks ciphers with small block sizes? That's the codebook attack. All right. All right, what attack cracks ciphers with fixed round keys? That's the slide attack, all right. All right, what type of rounds encrypt only half the plain text? That's the Feistel system used by DES. All right. Kirk will have to tell me who they are if they want their points. Good. All right. All right, so AES in all its glory. Now DES was the old one with a 56-bit key, and that's not long enough. You can do 2 to the 56 calculations if you get a whole network of machines. So in 1997, they got about 20,000 Unix servers to join a network for like 3 months, and they cracked a 56-bit key by brute force. And after that, the privacy group, name it forgets me, the EFF. The EFF made a special box with special chips that could crack it in like a day and a half. So they totally cracked it, and so they can totally get in by trying all possible keys, and that humiliated the government into knocking off the DES. Now the simple fix was triple DES, which is just 3 rounds of DES with different keys, and that was so you could easily have backward compatibility. If you were a bank with installed infrastructure using DES, you could buy new stuff that spoke triple DES. And if you, in triple DES, you encrypt, decrypt, encrypt, so with 3 different keys. And if you set all 3 to the same, it's compatible with your old infrastructure. So it was possible to buy new stuff and run it in a low security mode for a while until you're ready to upgrade everything and then switch to the new stuff. That's why triple DS was invented. And with 3 keys and 3 rounds of encryption, it has an effective strength of 112 bits, which is strong enough to be plenty strong. It's just kind of inefficient and slow. So this was a temporary stopgap to hold us over while we moved from DES, and now AES is considered much better. It's faster, more efficient, and more secure. So,
what sort of hardware infrastructure do you need for either triple DES or AES?
Well, you can do it on any machine, but if you want it to be fast, you have special chips customized for the purpose, but you can use any general purpose computer. However, now all processors include AES built into them, which is better, more secure, and faster.
Are you running it on your laptop?
In principle, it is. When I write code, I write my own Python code and use libraries, and that does it the slow way. But the processor does have AES hardware options, and I think that's how it's used by browsers and stuff. Yeah.
The 3DES is 3 rounds encryption, right?
3DS is what?
3 rounds of encryption.
It is. It's 3 rounds of encryption, 3 rounds of DES, and in principle, it's plenty strong, almost as strong as AES. It's just slower, more calculation.
3 rounds of encryption with 3 different keys.
No, it's actually encryption, decryption, encryption is the most common way it's done, but it amounts to the same thing. The reason that is, you can do it with encryption 3 times, but usually you do EDE so that you can easily downgrade it to single DES. That was the original plan.
I didn't need 3. Use the same key.
Right, if you use the same key 3 times, you encrypt, decrypt, and encrypt, and so that's just an easy way to lower it down to 56 bits to be compatible with older stuff.
But is it better than the encrypted equipment compared to real encryption?
It's a very good question. Hey, is that better? You would think encrypting 3 times would be better. In practice, I think it's just the same. Decrypting is just as good as encrypting. Encrypt with 1 key, decrypt with another, encrypt with another. And so let's take a look at the video for AES, because I thought this was really quite helpful. And it was at one time a Flash video, but of course Flash is gone, but somebody put it on YouTube, thankfully. So this is the visualization of the Rind jail cipher, which is the thing that was chosen to be AES, and the most common version, 128 bits. So in comes the plain text and the key, and out comes the ciphertext. The plain text is the state, and this state is going to go through transformations. And this is the key, so you send this to the key schedule and generate more keys. And so here's the encryption process. You add a round key, then you go through 4 stages of changing it. You have 9 rounds like this, and then the last round you skip 1 step because it turns out to be a waste of time to do it on the last step. So here's the transformations. You substitute bytes. You just look them up in this SBox table. So you take the first hexadecimal digit for one direction and the next section for the other. You just look them up and substitute them with these keys from that SBox. Then you shift the rows, just rotate them over, and this will break structure vertically. If you had a vertical straight line, it would get scrambled. Then you want to shift it the other way, mix columns, So you take each column and multiply it by this matrix to scramble it the other way. That will break horizontal stripes. And then you add the round key to make each round different. You just do an XOR with the round key. And that's it. Those are the 4 steps. And each one of those steps is designed to be really fast on digital processors. Simple operations. You do that whole thing 9 times, and then the last round, you skip 1 step because it turns out that it's a linear step and it wouldn't add any security when done in the last round. So it's just be a waste of time.
How is the map gonna look?
What's that?
How's the map gonna look for these
How's the map? The math?
map? Yeah.
Well, these are all just simple matrix multiplications.
There has to be a reason for doing all those.
Oh, that's right. They chose them to carefully resist all known attacks. And we'll talk about some of them. But intuitively, it's just what you do when you make hash. You cut it this way, you cut it that way, you skirt it around, you cut it again, you cut it again. It's just how you scramble the data so that every pattern in the data is mixed out.
But do they have to use some map to justify what?
Absolutely. They carefully chose these, and they had candidates, and they attacked them. What they do, mathematicians develop these things, and they submit it to the contest, which is now happening for post-quantum crypto, and then for years, they attack each other's things. And then some of them get hacked and they go down, and the one that survives, they give it the prize and call it AES, the official government standard.
What's the map gonna look like?
Oh, I haven't looked at it. There's research papers by these people. Rinjail was the 2 mathematicians that invented it. And they write research papers in the mathematics journals. You can find them and read it. It's pretty dense stuff. So, but they're real mathematicians have developed this stuff. Like I say, in this course, I don't know the math. We're not really about the math. We're about just using it. But you can totally find it. It's all public knowledge. And that's why IBM wrote Lucifer, which was what they made GES, and the NIST shortened the key. Lucifer was originally a 128-bit key, and they mysteriously shortened it to 56 with no explanation. And that's why everybody assumes they did that so the NSA could get in. But this one, there didn't seem to be any fishy business. There's no evidence that they poisoned it in any way. It seems like the stuff we're using is really secure, just like the original mathematicians invented it. So you have an internal state. It's 4x4 array of 16 bytes. That starts out as the plain text, and then you do all these transformations to this, and it eventually turns into the ciphertext. So you add the round key, you go through the 4 steps of this with key 1, then you go to the next key from the key schedule and do it again, next key from the key schedule and do it again until you get to key 10. Here you skip 1 step that is just a linear transformation and would be easily reversed anyway, so there's no point wasting your computation power doing it on the last step. That's all.
But it is deterministic.
It's totally deterministic. That's, otherwise you wouldn't be able to...
Key and the same plain text message, you're
Yeah,
getting the same cipher.
Yes, absolutely. Feed in the same plain text and same key, you'll get the same answer. And of course, it has to be totally deterministic or you wouldn't be able to decrypt. So you can run it all backwards, and that's what decryption is. That's, all right, so here's, by the way, the book summary of what you're saying. Why do they do all this? If you didn't have key expansion, all rounds would use the same key, and it would be vulnerable to slide attacks. So you have to have the key schedule. Without adding the round key to every round, it wouldn't depend on the key in different rounds, and the different rounds wouldn't do anything. Substitute bytes is a nonlinear operation, which means it's difficult to break mathematically. And without that, it would be easily solvable. Without shift rows, changes in one column would never affect another column, and then you could focus on just part of it and crack it part by part, and that would weaken it. And without mixed columns, changes in a byte would not affect any other bytes the other way. Both of those, you would be able to break it into smaller puzzles, each row or each column, and break it separately. And that would effectively take you down to a small block size again. So it's, at this level, that's why they designed it. They designed it to address all the known ways to attack it. And that turned out to hold up for 21, 22 years now. Nobody's found a hole in it that matters.
I assume,
Yeah.
in order to analyze this, I assume they use Hammond distancing.
They try a lot of attacks. They do Hammond distance as part of it.
That's just a way to analyze how well the shuffling is gone.
Yes, I think they do. They use a lot of techniques, and I think including that. They use Hammond distance to analyze how well it's mixing things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can do it in Python. In Python, you just create a new AES, and we've done this before, I think, in demonstration. And then you can encrypt a block of 16 bytes. And here, there are different modes we're about to talk about. Here's the simplest mode, electronic code book, where every block of input is just encrypted with the key, and that's it. So if 2 blocks of input are the same, those 2 blocks of output would be the same. So you can encrypt something, and it will just turn into this random hexadecimal junk, and you can decrypt it, and it will go back to the original data that went in. But the data must be a 16-byte block, and the output will be a 16-byte block. So, to implement it, now you could write a separate function to do each of these things and use it over and over, and that would be slow. What's better is to make a table. Make a table to look up those little functions as much as possible, and that'll be faster. But what's even better is to have native instructions built into the processor, into the hardware, just for these operations.
Can
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah,
because I have an idea.
Yeah.
And you probably know whether people use it, but it seems to me it's
maybe.
AES, it's just a great permutation. That's all it is.
Technically, permutation and the other thing, substitution. Because
But it's
permutation
per-
alone wouldn't
but
be
it's
enough.
Permutation, you get this size of the input. It's
That's
the
right.
Same size. But how about an encryption algorithm that takes a size 1 and embeds it into something?
Ah, yes.
Your key
Yeah.
keys you into where you find a larger space.
Yes. The question is, would it be better to have a data that then turns into larger ciphertext? And the answer is yes, and there are systems that do that. The quantum proof systems that are under development do that. Like your data will turn into like a megabyte of stuff, and the key is like a megabyte. And we're going to see some hash functions that do that when we get there. There are systems that do that. Your small input turns into a big output. This one, though, these were part of the design specifications because they were thinking about speed. They wanted to be able to have a network encrypting every byte and a financial system encrypting every byte. They said you must have 128 bytes on the bits of input, 128 bits of output. This was designed to be really fast and efficient and clean. And they said you make it secure enough even within these limitations, and they were able to do that. But there are other systems, and we'll cover quite a few of them as we go ahead, that do in fact make it bigger. RSA, for example, makes it bigger. So OpenSSL uses a table, and so this is the actual code that does it. They look things up in tables. They shift it by 24 bits and look it up here, and shift it by 16 bits and look it up there. So they're just taking the bytes and then looking it up in tables, all these transformations. And that's, of course, the fast way to do it. But the problem is it'll be subject to timing attacks. The problem is the time for encryption will depend on the key. For example, a key of 0 will find it quicker than the others. And so therefore, that's a flaw. If you measure the amount of time it takes to encrypt something, you get some information about the key. And that's a problem with any kind of efficient coding. So one solution is to waste time. Always do the same steps whether you have to or not. So even if it's 0, go through all the steps you would if it was F. That's one way to go. That's one solution. A better solution is to use hardware, where hardware is built in and it just slides through the hardware so many clock cycles and you're done. And that's what's called native instructions. And almost all modern processors have AES-NI. This is why they tried to have real strict specifications. It has to be clean and pretty and fit in anything. And then we're going to make it the government standard, and everybody's going to build hardware and software everywhere to use it. And then we can have all our processors with special instructions to do this. And so there's a series of processors for this purpose and a series of AES instructions for this purpose in the assembly code, and that's what does it. And that makes it 10 times faster than lookup tables in RAM. It's just in the processor as a native command. So this is what is actually being used a lot these days. So then you can talk about whether it's secure. It has been designed to resist many types of attacks, but there's no perfect solution. For all you know, some brilliant person will find a crack and it will fall like so many things have fallen before it, but it's lasted for 22 years now and nobody's found a significant hole in it, for whatever that's worth. All right, new hardware security model from Marvell. Let me take a look at this and see. Yeah, this looks like AES security. Let me bring this up. Okay. Liquid 2 hardware security module, up to 1 million AES operations per second. Well, there you go. Yeah, hardware security modules are things you connect to a network to encrypt all the network traffic, and networks are going really fast now, so they made a new one, and I'm sure this is doing the stuff we're talking, hardware processors optimized just for encryption. So, yep, that's good to know for cloud data centers, so they can encrypt all the data zipping through their network. Good. Thanks for the link. All right, so now we can talk about modes of operation. So you have blocks of plain text going to blocks of ciphertext. The so-called textbook encryption, which is electronic code book, works like this. Each block is encrypted with the key to ciphertext, and that's it. Now the problem is, if you had two identical plain text, you get identical ciphertexts. And therefore, that's not really hiding all the information. So this is not a very good mode to use, and people that use it are generally humiliated eventually by somebody like me or something for reporting vulnerabilities for them using it. That's electronic code book. So if you put in, you can do it in Python, if you put in 16 bytes and then the same 16 bytes again in the plain text and encrypt it, you will get 66cc2 and over here 66cc2 again, because each 16 byte block is just encrypted the same. And therefore, even though I don't know what it is, I know you repeated something. And you'll see this if you look at hashed passwords using a similar system with no variation. I can tell that two people have the same password, even though I don't know what it is, because they have the same hash.
And then you can use frequency analysis.
Well, in principle, you could use frequency analysis. In fact, with the block size this big, it's too hard to do. But yeah, then you could use, there is no way to do the next step with AES. There's no way to extract the key from it, but you can at least see patterns. And sometimes the pattern is enough. And so the Staples Android app, for example, does that. I use this for my password, 32 A's followed by some letters. And they store the encrypted password on your phone. Here it is in one of the files, an XML file, and it's a block of base 64. But when you reverse the base 64, it looks like this: 16 bytes, and then the same 16 bytes again, and then some more. So that's how you can tell they're using AES in electronic codebook mode, which is one of the many things wrong with this system. Anyway, and the other one, I didn't demonstrate this in this class, did I? I think I demonstrated. Oh, good. Okay, so we'll do this later in the project. This is the famous one they say, letting your penguin show. If you have an image in an uncompressed bitmap, so it encodes each byte separately, then all these bytes are just gray, 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 and all these are just black, 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 black. So there are blocks of 16 gray and another block of 16 gray and another block of 16 gray. So when you encrypt the image, you can still see the image. All these turn into one color. At the border, it varies, but any block of substantial size, a block of solid color, remains a substantial size block of solid color, and this is not what you want encryption to do. You want encryption to scramble it so I can't see the penguin anymore, and it totally fails to do that in electronic codebook mode. So this is the most common solution, cipher block chaining. You have a key, and you use the same key every time, but you have an initialization vector, which is just another random 16-byte thing. And you XOR the plain text with that before you encrypt it, and then you take the ciphertext here and use this for the IV for the next one. So randomly XOR it here, and therefore, even if two blocks of plain text are the same, they're XORed with something that's different, and now every block is altered. So now, when you encrypt this, you get that. And that's what you want for encryption. It should just be scrambled, so you can't see that. That's why this is very popular. Everybody used this for a long time. This was the preferred mode. Because it has this desirable property. You encrypt something, it really turns into random snow, it's gone. That's what you want. However, there are weaknesses in that system. One thing is, if you keep using the same IV over and over, then if you go back here, if I use the same IV again and again, then every plain text is being encrypted with the same system. And if I have two messages that begin with the same plain text, again, I'll get the same output. So you really should choose a different IV for every time and not reuse it. Otherwise, it has some of the flaws of electronic codebook. So that's not too bad. That's just a caution in how you use it. Now, here's another flaw. Electronic codebook can be parallelized. If you go back to this one, because of heat dissipation, there was a speed war on processors. They kept making them faster. Half a megahertz, gigahertz, half a gigahertz, 1 gigahertz, 2 gigahertz, 4 gigahertz. They couldn't get above about 4 gigahertz because they could not dissipate the heat from the processor. It would melt. So they went to parallel processing instead, 4 cores, 8 cores, 16 cores, but all those cores are separate. So you need to have only certain operations can be parallelized, and this one can. I could run this in one core, and that in another core, and that in another core. They could all be doing their blocks simultaneously separately. So this is a good thing about electronic codebook mode. It is possible to parallelize it and gain a benefit from multiple processors, like we have now. This cannot be parallelized. You cannot encrypt this block until you've encrypted the block before it to get the IV. This is only going to work on one core. And that's a fundamental weakness of cipher block chaining. It's not a mathematical flaw, but it is a practical limitation that makes it less efficient on a modern computer. All right. So then the other flaw in it is much more serious, and that comes from message length. Now, the fundamental thing here, you can only encrypt a block of 16 bytes. You can't do anything else. It's got to have 16 bytes coming in. So if you're trying to encrypt something short like hello, it will just stop and say, nope, input strings must be a multiple of 16 in length. You cannot encrypt 5 bytes. Can't be done. It requires 16 bytes. So you have to pad it somehow. Now, you could pad it a lot of ways, but this is the standard padding that almost everybody uses. And it works like this. If you need 1 byte of padding, use 1. If you need 2 bytes, use 0202. If you need 3, put in 3 threes. And if you don't need any padding, then add an entire block of 16 characters with 16 in hexadecimal. And the point of this is, when you're done decoding it, you look at the last byte, and then you remove that many bytes to get back to the original. This is, you pad it with this kind of padding, and then it will be easy to remove the padding when you decrypt. Otherwise, you would not know where the message ended. So this is the standard system with this official designation. This is what everybody uses. And this leads to the padding oracle attack. Since almost everything uses this, people actually implemented this in a whole bunch of software, including some Java servers, but they also had an error message that told you if upon decryption the padding was wrong, which was what must have seemed like a helpful message to the developers, but the fact that they gave you that message, instead of just a generic message, something went wrong, ruined everything. Just telling you that the problem was in the padding is enough to shatter the whole thing like glass. And that's a side channel attack. And this is why people say cryptography is really hard. You make one minor design decision that doesn't seem like a big deal, and it ruins everything. And a bunch of people made that error. So there's a better system. We'll talk about the padding oracle attack a little more later, but this is called the padding oracle. You can use the padding to deduce information about the key. So the alternative, by the way, has been developed, which is essentially perfect, which is called ciphertext stealing. Wait, I see something. Wouldn't the heat thing lend itself to side attack by heat signature? Well, yeah, that's essentially what side channel attacks do. The heat itself is not a fast, usually use the emitted radio as a more precise side channel than the heat, but in principle, the heat could also give you information, how hot it gets. Yeah, that's another possible side attack, side channel attack. Anyway, so what you do now is you pad with zeros, and then you swap the last 2 blocks of ciphertext. So you just pad it with 0, and then you reverse these 2, so they're out of order. So this one is used to generate the IV for that one. This one turns out to end all the known attacks. Turns out to end the padding oracle attack and all other attacks and be perfectly fine, but in practice, nobody uses it. It turns out to be a little clumsy to code. There are 3 different ways to implement it. Almost nobody ever bothers. It might look simple, but in fact, it's hard to write good code. It's hard to do it right. There's a bunch of things you're going to find in this book where they invented a system that would solve the problem, but people found it too difficult to code. And they stuck with the older system that has the problem that just isn't that bad. And of course, once something is the standard, then you want to stick with it because you've got all the hardware built and all the legacy devices, and you don't want to make that stuff obsolete unless you have a really good reason. Not just that in theory there's something wrong with it, but in practice there's a real attack that's getting in. So counter mode is now considered the best way to do it. What you do, it's like electronic code book, but you add a counter. You XOR it with a counter. And you just choose numbers here. And you could just choose 1, 2, 3, but it's considered cooler to use something called Gala mode, which uses some kind of mathematical function to start with a number and create a series of numbers here that are pseudo-random. You just create these nonces to add to XOR with the plain text each time.
What are the dual lines?
I think it means XOR.
Well,
But I think it might.
Plus meant
Yeah, no, I thought so too. It might mean append it. That's why I'm not quite sure. But it's supposed to be XOR with the plain text in my understanding, and that makes me worry about the symbol. So I might have that detail wrong. But anyway, you have this is essentially the IV, and you create a different IV for each block with just a schedule, like the key schedule with a predictable series here. So now you can do it parallelized, and it's secure. Each one has a thing added to it, and this does not depend on the previous block, which is the fundamental flaw of CBC, cipher block chaining. The fact that the output here is used as the IV there turned out to be a flaw. When I first heard of that, that looked really fishy to me. The ciphertext is mixed in with the plain text here, and that does cause a flaw. Here you don't have that flaw. So this is currently considered the best mode. Your most modern implementations will usually use GCM, Galois counter mode. And that's called the nonce, a number used only once, and that's used to create these ciphers, and you do something like just raise it to different powers to generate them all, or use some other function to just create a series of numbers from the original one, and use those for each block. And the N is not secret, just like the IV is not secret. All right. And again, you can't reuse the nonce. If you did, then all the nonces would be the same, and you'd have the same bit stream, and therefore you could just XOR two ciphertext together to recover the plain text. And this is what happened to a whole lot of products, including Microsoft Word before 2008. You could password encrypt Microsoft Word documents, but there was no nonce or IV used. So if you just had two Microsoft Word documents encrypted with the same password, you could just XOR them and a bunch of it would just come clean. Microsoft made this mistake over and over and over because a lot of people didn't know any better around 2000, and Microsoft learned, but they kept acquiring companies and building in their software which hadn't learned. So the same mistake kept cropping up over and over, which is another thing that happens a lot in security. The whole industry kind of evolves as a whole. And if people just have a bad practice, everybody does it, and it's a while before they stop. Like I was talking to a security professional a few years ago at DEF CON China, and she told me everybody is still using hard-coded, unchangeable backdoor passwords for maintenance, which is something we were all supposed to stop doing 20 years ago, but a bunch of people have still not got the memo. And I know last year, I think Cisco got caught 7 times doing that. Once people get in a bad habit, it's hard to get them out of it. Anyway, so the counter mode doesn't need any padding. That's another nice thing. If you think about it, this is just going to you're going to take the encryption of the key and XOR it with the plain text. So this is really just creating a key stream, which is XORed byte by byte with the plain text. So if you don't have enough bytes to fill it, it doesn't need to. It encrypts just the nonce with the counter appended to it. Now I understand. That's why this is appending, not XOR. Take the nonce with the counter appended to it and just encrypt that with the key. You don't use the plain text. You just encrypt the nonce, encrypt the next nonce, encrypt the next nonce. That creates a pseudo-random bit stream like a one-time pad. Then you just XOR that with the plain text. So the output will be as long as the plain text, and it doesn't need to fill the block. There's no issue of padding. Another advantage of it.
So when the counter gets to the size of the register in which it's being held, it goes back to the nonce.
I suppose that's true, but everything is like 64 or 128 bits, so that would be an unthinkably huge number. Yeah, what he's saying is, in principle, at some point you will have run out of different nonces, and it'll start repeating, which I guess is true. But that would be around 2 to the 64 or 2 to the 128, so you'll never get there. All right, so counter doesn't require any padding. There's no problem with padding oracles. It's faster than any other mode, and it can be parallelized. So it's pretty much the boss solution for everything. And if we could start over again, we should all be using that. But there's a huge legacy of stuff using the other modes, and it's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So, things that can go wrong. There's 2 main attacks, meet in the middle and the padding oracle. Now, meet in the middle is why there's triple des. When I first heard this, I had the same question everybody has. Why don't you just use double des? And why do you say that triple des only has a security of 112 bits? Seems like it should have 3 times 56 bits. And it doesn't. It only has 2 times 56 bits, and this is why. So here's how it works. You encrypt with key 1, you decrypt with key 2, you encrypt with key 3. This is how triple des is normally done. So there's 3 keys, each 56 bits wide. So that would mean 3 times 56, 168 bits. It would take 2 to the 168 calculations to brute force all those keys. All right. But if you had double des, then you would have 2 to the 112 calculations to brute force it, so that would seem fine, but you don't have to do it that way. Since it's done in 2 steps, and you know how to do it in 2 steps, what you do is you make a list of all possible encryptions with all possible keys, 56 bits here. And then you make a list of this one going backwards, all 56 bits. So that is 2 to the 56 calculations, and here's another 256 calculations. You find the value that's the same on those 2 lists, and you've got both keys. So it does not take 2 to the 112 calculations, it only takes 2 to the 57 calculations. This is called meet in the middle. Any kind of encryption system that you can split in half is subject to this flaw. You can reduce it to 2 problems with only the square root of the complexity. So that's why you have to have triple DES. Now, even if you cut it in half, 1/2 is 112 bits. So the security here is 2 to the 112. That's right. So that's meet in the middle. And that applies to a whole bunch of algorithms. All right. And so that's the game. Now the padding oracle is amazing good fun, and we'll do projects on it. So suppose you're encrypting something that is 3 blocks long. So your plain text is here, 16 bytes, and another 16 bytes, and another 16 bytes. You have a key, and you have an initialization vector. So you XOR, let's see, what I see here? Yes, and I saw a question here. Let me go back to that one. This one here, yes, you have a key, and a key 2 and key 3. All 3 keys are totally different. You can feed them in as all different. Now, and like I say, the reason you do it this way, with encrypt, decrypt, and encrypt, is because if you want to have single DES, and your hardware is doing triple DES, all you have to do is make the 3 keys the same, and it will be single DES. It will encrypt, decrypt, and encrypt. But normally, you make all 3 keys different, and then you get your 112 bits of security. That's the correct way to do triple DES. Not that it matters, except for historical reasons. I think nobody's using triple DES hardly at all anymore. They would have to have infrastructure older than the year 2000, which might be true at some places like banks or something, but most everybody is upgraded to AES by now. Good. All right, so here's the deal. So you encrypt this one, you XOR it with plain text, and you run it through encryption with the key, and that's your ciphertext. Then you take this ciphertext and use it as the IV, so you XOR it with this plain text, encrypt it, and on you go. So now, if it doesn't fill all the blocks, it's only 47 bytes, then you have to add a padding byte at the end, shown here in pink. So that's how you encrypt 47 bytes with AES in cipher block chaining mode. Now, when you decrypt, it looks like this. You feed in the ciphertext, you run it through the decryption, then you XOR it with the initialization vector. And you take this ciphertext, and that's the initialization vector for this one. And this is the weakness. Upon decryption, this ciphertext is XORed right there, right next to the plain text. This simple operation, remember, the typical attacker situation is you can see the ciphertext, but you don't know the key. So I know this, and this is closely related to the decryption right here. This relationship between ciphertext I can see and the decryption step here, with a very simple operation I can easily understand, is a weakness we can exploit, and that's what we're going to do.
But you went through a couple of rounds, right?
Yeah, this is, but the AES is 10 rounds. We're not going to do anything about that at all. We're not going to
Go 10 rounds, right?
Oh, yeah, but this does take 1 block and run it through 10 rounds and come out here. Every block is individually run through 10 rounds. It doesn't mix the different blocks together. If it did, that would prevent this. So here's the padding oracle. If you change this byte, then this whole plain text will be shot. It will all be wrong. You've changed the ciphertext, it will decrypt into garbage. But what effect will it have here? It will only affect the last byte, because the only effect of this ciphertext on the next one is here with XOR, and when I change that byte, it will only change this byte. So when I change that byte to values, I will only find 2 values that work. All the rest will have invalid padding. If I leave it alone, it will have its original value and will have correct padding. And if I change it to a value that creates a 1 here, it will again have correct padding. That's the padding oracle. If an error message tells me whether the padding was correct, I can deduce a value here. This value here, I can deduce that orange value by changing this until I find the changed value that results in correct padding. I know that must be a 1. And then I can go back and change this one, and I know that must be a 2. And this one, and I know that must be a 3. I can deduce every one of these orange bytes. And I only have to guess 256 times for each one of them. So without very many guesses at all, I can deduce this entire block of 16 bytes of this intermediate value. And then I can make this plain text into anything I want by just choosing malicious values here. As long as I'm willing to sacrifice 16 bytes it'll turn into garbage, I can forge a message here. The decryption will work, it will be valid, and it will say whatever I want it to say. That's the padding oracle attack.
So that compromises that part of the plain text, but does
Yes.
that give you the key for the whole plain text?
I do believe there are some versions that get the key, but I don't know how to do that. This is the only one I know how to do. This lets you forge a message.
Yeah,
And that is enough to do horrible things, as you can imagine. There are a bunch of systems, for example, that authenticate you by this. If you send them a message and they can successfully decrypt it, they say that proves you're the administrator. You must have the key. And so just being able to make a message that decrypts it all is enough to fool a bunch of systems to think I'm the administrator. But now I can even pass up a command. I can put in a 16-byte command here, and it will believe it's true and execute it. And so it only works, of course, if it will tolerate 16 bytes of garbage, but there are a bunch of systems that do. One common one is web pages. If you go to web pages, let me bring up a text document here to type in. If you talk about this more in the web app hacking course, but a web page typically is like site.com/admin.php question, and then time equals and code equals and action equals. And so on. You have a whole series of parameters here. And it is, in fact, very commonly the case that if a bunch of this is garbage, it will just be ignored, and it will carefully use this. So it is often the case that you can tolerate destroying 16 bytes of it to forge the next 16 bytes, and now you have authenticated as administrator and executed an action at the other end. So this turned out to be the kiss of death. Yep. That's the padding oracle attack. It's good, clean fun. So, like I say, you can go 256 places here. We'll get the next byte, and on you go. So now I can forge this to say anything, at the cost of collateral damage, turning this into garbage. And that's the padding oracle attack that we're going to do. And there are some programs you can download to do automated padding oracle attacks, and I think some of them actually do get the key. And I don't quite know how that works, but this much I was able to figure out how to do. So let's try another Kahoot. See, not that one, but this one. 141 4B. That looks like it. All right. That's where I would save this one. All right. Okay, I think we got whoever's coming. All right, so what system exposes AES to timing attacks? And the table-based code, where it's looking things up in tables, takes a different amount of time depending on the key. All right. Which system is vulnerable to padding oracle? main thing this tests. Cipher block chaining. The fundamental part where one block depends on the previous block, that is the flaw that we're exploiting, and that's cipher block chaining, where you chain it one block into the next block. All right, which system requires special processor instructions? Native instructions. All right. And what system leaves your penguin visible? A famous statement. People often refer to it, that famous demonstration. That's the electronic codebook, also called textbook encryption, which is why professional cryptographers hate college professors. They never use anything a college professor does, because it's always like that. It just has the easy part. They didn't really think about what you really have to do in practice, and if you use that stuff, you'll be sorry. Anyway. All right, what system converts AES into a stream cipher? Yeah, that's counter mode. Counter mode creates a stream of random bits, essentially a stream cipher. All right. And therefore, it's the most elegant and probably the most perfect system, but it's not used that much because the others got here first. All right, Keegan's won twice. That's Stu and Pete. One twice. Good. All right, so I've got the winners. And it's just 7:06, so let's take a break till 7:15, and then I'm going to demonstrate some stuff. Let me find my recording and stop it.